Welcome once again to the Cigar Room of Doom and another episode of A Little Knowledge. One of the reasons I'm doing today's episode is in the comments for my initial post, which granted was a bit long, was an observation that I'd mentioned that I'd made a lot of mistakes and asked how I might convey to people what those mistakes were and how to avoid them. Well, a really obvious one is when you're doing your laundry and there is a very large detergent looking bottle on top of the washer, do not just pour it in assuming that it's detergent. It may in fact be Drano. It was, in fact, Drano. On a grander scale, though, I was really actually excited to get this question because I think it's a really valid question. We're human. We all make mistakes, and we make any number on any given day. And so for me, I genuinely expect that one aspect of this entire video log is there will be stories told. There will be embarrassing incidents conveyed. Just thinking off the top of my head, I can think of a lot of errors that I've made in over the course of my career, in the case of my friendships, in the case of a lot of my relationships. And honestly, there's a lot of mistakes other people have made as well, but I won't really talk about those too much because those are really other people's mistakes and much more part of their story than mine. What I can tell you, though, is what one of the biggest overall mistakes of thought that I had made for a very long time. I let life happen to me. And I didn't really step up to understand how much actual effect that I had over that. The youngest of four kids. All my older brothers, much more charismatic, much more charming, much more social. I was the quiet, introspective one in my youth. And I did a lot of book reading, which was great. Had a great vocabulary at a young age, which was great. But I was very easily swayed and very easily directed in a lot of things. Didn't make a lot of decisions because I didn't have a lot of faith in the soundness of my choices. And therefore, I let a lot of life happen. And when things would go poorly, I would actively blame other folks. I would blame my parents for putting me in a small private school, which actually turned out to be a real benefit. I would blame my other older brothers for not getting along with me that well because, for the most part, they're half brothers. I would blame my boss when I would make mistakes at work. I would consider them oppressive. I would blame society and be angry and kicking and screaming, and everything was against me. The fates were against me. The gods themselves were frowning upon me. And I got older and I really tried to do better, but I didn't have the social skills. I didn't have the understanding or the patience or oftentimes the tact. I didn't really grasp the repercussions of my actions because I was so self focused on how everything was being wronged to me that I couldn't see how I was being perceived to others. And that can be a real challenge sometimes. There was even a remarkably dark time when I will tell you a large part of my life absolutely exploded around me. And all I could think about was the people who had put me in that position and how misled I had been and how mistreated I had been. And oh boy, it was going to be a grand day when, for whatever reason, they would make amends to me and make up for all those horrible things. You know, that doesn't work. Other people really don't owe you anything. You really you really need to understand the concept of self-manifestation. And the best advice that I could actually honestly give And the greatest thing that I actually learned after all those years of self-centered, narcissistic horseshit is that ultimately you have to own your shit. You have to acknowledge that you are where you are because you chose to be there. You have to acknowledge that you are on the path that you walked. Because ultimately, other people have no control over you. Other people are not accountable to you for your own choices. Other people, if they choose to do a kindness, can certainly help defray consequences, but ultimately, the consequences of the action are included in the action itself, which is something that I picked up from 1984, way back when. The concept being that once you decide to do something, you are implicitly accepting the consequence of the action, because if you're doing something, you've given it some degree of thought. And somewhere deep in your cerebellum, you have agreed that I'm doing this thing. I accept there will be circumstances. By doing this thing, I accept these circumstances. It's just part of being an adult. And that's where a lot of the real challenge comes in. And it goes for good or for ill. It's not just a question of owning your choices. It's a question of being willing to step up and stand up and accept the consequences of your failures. If you do something wrong to someone, it is your responsibility to say, hey, I screwed up. I accept the circumstances. I would really like it if you would make them nice circumstances and not necessarily, break my thumbs or something. But if you do feel that that's a necessary compulsion, what you're gonna do? I mean, I did kind of ask for something, a thumb-breaking worthy level of offense. Mind you, all of this stuff should be done with an appropriate scale. I would really almost expect thumb breaking to be kind of a pool sharking kind of necessity, and not stealing the last Nutter Butter. Speaking of which, by the way, son, I've eaten a large portion of your Nutter Butters. If you happen to watch this, if you don't happen to watch it, I'm pretty sure your mother did it. Anyway, now the real challenge that I find with this, actually, first and foremost, I found that this has been a really positive sort of thing. And the more that I own my particular choices, the more that I'm able to let other people own theirs. And while I find it very difficult to stand in judgment of other people for their choices, I can certainly feel bad for the people affected by their actions. I can certainly feel bad for someone going down a negative path that I may have gone down before, and recognize I can also acknowledge the fact that I haven't walked their path. I don't know why they make their choices and why it seems necessary. On a final note, and here's where I actually still have a lot of difficulty, it's not just a question of owning your failures. It is not just a question of owning your choices that lead to negative circumstances. It is a challenge to accept your successes. And that is one of the toughest things that I find people dealing with. We are so engrossed in a kind of mentality where it always feels like we're being watched, where it always feels like we're being scrutinized, it always feels like we're being judged. And strangely enough, the more that you let go of personal judgment of other people, the less you feel that judgment, but you will still oftentimes tend to be your most aggressive critic on your own actions. And even though I've accomplished a tremendous amount, I still find myself dealing with a lot of that doubt. And that's understandable, but not necessarily logical. Anyway, so long story short, my biggest mistake was not taking ownership of my own actions. My biggest mistake was not taking ownership of my life and wasting so much time spinning my wheels, insisting that life was happening to me. The best way to work around that, I've found, is taking ownership of my shit. stepping up when I do something wrong, being humble when I do something right, and instead of letting life happen to me, aggressively going out and happening to life. And with that, I will sit back and think, you know what? I really need a snappy sign off sort of thing. You know, like love, luck, and lollipops, or safe travels, my hoopy droogs. Actually, I think that's a little cross culturing. That's something we'll work on. Exactly. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.